Margaret had lived in the same old Victorian house for nearly 4 decades. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was home, a place where laughter echoed through the halls and memories were stitched into every creaky floorboard. She shared her life with Harold, a kind man who loved her deeply. They weren't rich, but they didn't need much to be happy. Their days passed quietly, filled with small joys like morning coffee together or evening walks around the neighborhood. But there was one thing about their marriage that always puzzled Margaret: Harold's strange rule about the attic. From the day they moved in, he made it crystal clear she wasn't allowed to go up there, not even once. At first, she thought it was just an odd quirk, maybe because he didn't want her climbing the steep stairs or dealing with dust. But over time, she realized it was more than that. Every time she brought up the attic, Harold would tense up. His voice would drop low, almost as if he were afraid someone might overhear him. "You don't need to go up there," he'd say, firmly, his eyes avoiding hers. "It's not safe? Not safe?" That excuse never sat right with her. Sure, the attic was probably dusty and cluttered, but how dangerous could it really be? Still, she respected his wishes and let it go for a while. Over the years, though, her curiosity grew stronger. What was so special about that space above the house? Why did Harold act like it held some dark secret? When Harold passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, Margaret felt like part of her world crumbled. He was gone, and suddenly the house felt emptier, colder. Without him, the room seemed lonelier, the silence heavier. Grief hung over her like a thick fog, making everything feel distant and surreal. But as weeks turned into months, and then years, something else began creeping into her mind: the attic. 35 years slipped by after Harold's death, and Margaret found herself alone in the house they had built their lives in. By now she was older, her hair streaked with silver and her steps slower than before. Yet the mystery of the attic lingered, gnawing at her like an unanswered question. One stormy evening, as rain drummed against the windows and lightning lit up the shadows in the corners of the house, Margaret finally decided enough was enough. She couldn't keep living under the same roof with the forbidden room forever. She had to know what Harold had been hiding. With trembling hands, she went to his study, the room where he used to spend hours reading or writing letters. After searching through drawers and cabinets, she discovered a rusty key tucked inside an old cigar box. It was small, tarnished with age, and looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. This must have been the key to the attic. Her heart raced as she held it in her palm, wondering why Harold had hidden it so carefully. The attic door stood at the end of a narrow hallway, almost blending into the wall. Margaret hesitated for a moment, staring at the faded wood grain and the brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Was she ready for this? What if whatever lay behind that door changed everything she thought she knew about Harold and their life together? Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. It stuck at first, stubborn from years of disuse, but eventually it clicked open. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it inward, revealing a set of steep, rickety stairs leading upward. Margaret grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started climbing, each step groaning beneath her weight. The air grew colder and thicker the higher she went, carrying with it the smell of damp wood and forgotten things. At the top, she swung the flashlight around, illuminating the cramped space. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam of light, catching on cobwebs that stretched like ghostly threads between beams and rafters. The attic was packed with boxes stacked haphazardly, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and trunks lined up along the walls. It looked like any other neglected storage area, except there was something off about it, something unsettling. As Margaret ventured deeper, her flashlight caught glimpses of peculiar objects: an old painting leaning against the wall, its canvas facing away from her. A locked trunk sitting in the far corner. Stacks of papers tied neatly with ribbons that had long since lost their color. Her pulse quickened when she noticed a name carved into one of the wooden beams above the trunk. Eleanor. Eleanor. Who was she? And why did seeing her name make Margaret's skin crawl? Whatever secrets Harold had kept locked away in this attic, they weren't going to stay hidden anymore. With shaking hands, Margaret reached for the trunk's lid, knowing that opening. It might change her life forever. The anticipation weighed heavily on her chest as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a jumble of items that seemed out of place, a collection of photographs, showing a young woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and a journal with brittle pages. As Margaret flipped through the journal, her stomach churned. The entries spoke of betrayal, guilt, and fear. Someone had scribbled notes in the margins, handwriting that looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. This wasn't just some random stash of forgotten belongings. It was evidence of a story that predated her marriage to Harold, a story he had worked hard to bury. And now it was hers to uncover. Margaret stood frozen in the attic, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the brittle pages of the journal. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of years was pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world Harold had tried desperately to keep hidden, not just from her, but from everyone. The name Eleanor echoed in her mind like a ghostly whisper. Who was this woman, and why did her presence feel so haunting? She flipped through the journal carefully, afraid the fragile paper might crumble under her touch. Each page revealed fragments of a life long forgotten, entries filled with emotions that ranged from joy to despair. Eleanor wrote about dreams she once had, people she loved, and moments she cherished. But as Margaret read further, the tone shifted. The later entries were darker, tinged with anger and betrayal. One line stood out, *, I trusted him completely, and now I see how wrong I was. *, who was him? Margaret's heart sank as she realized it could only mean one person, Harold. Her Harold. The man who had shared his life with her for nearly 40 years. How could he have been part of something so painful? She tried to push the thought away, telling herself there must be another explanation. Maybe Eleanor was talking about someone else entirely. But deep down, she knew better. Among the scattered belongings in the attic, Margaret noticed a stack of old newspaper clippings tucked inside a shoebox. They were yellowed with age, their edges frayed, but the headlines were still legible. One article caught her eye, **, local woman vanishes without a trace. **, below it was a black and white photograph of a young woman smiling brightly, a face Margaret recognized instantly. It was Eleanor. The article described how Eleanor had disappeared mysteriously over 50 years ago. No one knew where she went or what happened to her. Some believed she ran away, while others whispered about foul play. The case remained unsolved, leaving behind only questions and rumors. Margaret's hands shook as she read the details. Eleanor had lived in this very house before Harold bought it. That much was clear, but what connection did she have to him? Digging deeper, Margaret uncovered more clues. There were letters tied together with faded ribbon addressed to Eleanor. Most of them were ordinary notes from friends and family, but one envelope stood out. It was unopened, its seal intact, and written in neat handwriting was a single word, "Forgive me." Margaret hesitated for a moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a letter, unsigned, but unmistakably written by someone who knew Eleanor. Well, the words were cryptic yet chilling. *, you deserve to know the truth. I didn't mean for things to spiral out of control. Please believe me when I say I never wanted to hurt you. If anything happens to you, I will carry this guilt for the rest of my days. *, the letter ended abruptly, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. Who wrote it? Was it Harold? Or someone else connected to Eleanor's disappearance? Margaret's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. Whoever wrote those words sounded tormented, burdened by regret. Could Harold have been carrying that same weight all these years? As she continued exploring the attic, Margaret stumbled upon a painting leaning against the wall. Its canvas faced away from her, almost as if it were deliberately turned to hide something. Curiosity got the better of her, and she gently spun it around. What she saw made her gasp. The painting depicted a serene countryside scene, but what shocked her wasn't the artwork itself. It was the signature scrawled in the bottom corner. It was Harold's name. Harold painted? Margaret had no idea he even had an artistic side. He rarely spoke about his hobbies or interests before they met, always brushing off such topics with vague responses. Now she wondered if this painting held some significance beyond its beauty. Was it a gift for Eleanor, a token of apology, or something else entirely? Her search led her to another discovery, a small jewelry box tucked beneath a pile of dusty blankets. When she opened it, she found a delicate locket inside. The metal was tarnished, but the design was intricate, suggesting it had once been treasured. Margaret clicked it open, revealing 2 tiny photographs. On one side was a picture of Eleanor, her smile radiant and full of life. On the other side was a face that stopped Margaret cold. It was Harold, but not the Harold she knew. This was a younger version of him, barely recognizable, with a mischievous glint in his eyes and a confident smirk. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to entertain the unthinkable. Had Harold known Eleanor personally? Were they close? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. All these years she had assumed Harold's past was simple, unremarkable. But now, it seemed his history was far more complicated and far darker than she ever imagined as the storm outside raged on. Thunder rolling across the sky, Margaret sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by relics of a life she knew nothing about. She felt torn between disbelief and dread. Every item she uncovered painted a clearer picture of a story steeped in sorrow and secrets. Yet, the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had Harold forbidden her from coming here? Was it to protect her from the truth? Or to protect himself? Margaret's thoughts drifted back to their life together. Harold had always been kind, loving, and attentive. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was hers. How could the same man who held her hand through sickness and celebrated their anniversaries have been involved in something so sinister? The contradiction was too much to bear. Exhaustion began to creep in, but Margaret refused to leave the attic. She needed answers, even if they shattered the image of the man she thought she knew. As she sifted through the remaining boxes, she found something that sent chills down her spine, a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of old rugs. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Her breath hitched as she knelt down and examined the edges. A heavy padlock secured it shut, its rusted surface hinting at decades of neglect. What could possibly be hidden underneath? Margaret's instinct screamed at her to stop, to walk away and pretend she'd never found any of this. But curiosity burned brighter than fear. She rummaged through the attic until she found a crowbar tucked behind a stack of crates. With trembling hands, she pried the lock open, each metallic groan echoing ominously in the silence. When the trapdoor finally creaked open, Margaret peered inside, her flashlight casting a narrow beam into the darkness below. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, as she leaned closer, something gleamed faintly in the light, a bundle of cloth wrapped tightly around a shape that looked disturbingly familiar. Her stomach churned as she reached for it, pulling it into the dim light of the attic. When she unwrapped the cloth, her blood ran cold. Inside was a knife, its blade dull and rusted, but unmistakably stained with dried blood. Beneath the knife lay a final letter, folded neatly and sealed with wax. Written on the front in elegant script were the words, "To Harold, Margaret's." Hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor, her words filled with pain and accusation. She accused Harold of cruelty, manipulation, and betrayal. The last sentence pierced Margaret's heart like a dagger. Asterisk. If anything happens to me, you will know. Why? Asterisk tears blurred her vision as she sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had uncovered. Harold hadn't just lost Eleanor, he had destroyed her. Margaret sat on the attic floor, clutching the letter in trembling hands. The words swam before her eyes, each sentence carving deeper into her heart. She had always believed Harold was a good man, someone who loved her unconditionally. But now, faced with this undeniable proof of his past, she felt like she didn't know him at all. Who was the man she had spent nearly 40 years of her life with? Was he the kind, gentle soul she thought she knew, or was he someone else entirely? The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled through the night, matching the turmoil brewing inside Margaret. She stared at the knife, its rusted blade catching faint glimmers of light from her flashlight. It wasn't just an old tool, it was evidence of something far darker. Something that had been buried for decades, hidden away in this attic like a skeleton in the closet. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Eleanor's letters, the newspaper clippings, the locket, the painting, and now this knife all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Harold hadn't just known Eleanor, he had played a role in her disappearance. Maybe not directly, but enough to carry the guilt for the rest of his life. That's why he forbade her from coming here. He didn't want her to find out what he'd done or what he might have allowed to happen. But Margaret couldn't stop now. She owed it to Eleanor and to herself to uncover the whole truth. If Harold had kept these secrets locked away, then it was up to her to bring them into the light. With renewed determination, she decided to dig deeper. She needed answers, even if they shattered the image of the man she thought she knew. The next morning, after a restless night spent staring at the ceiling, Margaret headed to the local library. She knew the town had archives of old newspapers and records, and she hoped to piece together more of the story. The librarian greeted her warmly, recognizing her as a regular visitor over the years. Margaret explained that she was researching some family history, careful not to reveal too much. She didn't want anyone connecting her search to Harold or the house. Sitting at a wooden table, surrounded by dusty books and microfilm machines, Margaret began scrolling through archived newspapers. It didn't take long to find articles about Eleanor's disappearance. The headline screamed off the pages, asterisk, asterisk, young woman vanishes without explanation. Search continues for missing local resident. Asterisk, asterisk, one article mentioned that Eleanor had last been seen leaving a cafe in town, visibly upset. Witnesses claimed she argued with someone earlier that day, though no one could identify who. Another article hinted at rumors of a troubled relationship, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. As Margaret sifted through the clippings, she came across a name that made her heart skip a beat, Harold's. In one of the older articles, a reporter briefly mentioned that Eleanor's fiancé, a young man named Harold, had been questioned by authorities but released due to lack of evidence. Fiancé? Margaret's stomach churned. So Harold and Eleanor weren't just acquaintances. They were engaged to be married. And yet, something went horribly wrong between them. Piecing together the timeline, Margaret realized that Eleanor vanished shortly after accusing Harold of betrayal. The journal entries she found in the attic painted a picture of a woman betrayed, hurt, and desperate to escape. Had Harold driven her away? Or worse, had he done something unthinkable? Margaret couldn't bring herself to think the worst, but The facts were hard to ignore. Back home, Margaret returned to the attic, her mind swirling with questions. She examined every item again, looking for anything she might have missed. Among the clutter, she discovered another box tucked behind. A stack of old books. Inside was a collection of photographs, most of them faded with age. She flipped through them slowly, her breath catching when she saw a picture of Harold and Eleanor together. They looked so happy, standing arm in arm in front of the very house they lived in. Harold's smile was genuine, his eyes bright with affection. Eleanor radiated joy, her laughter almost palpable even in the stillness of the photograph. It was painful to see how different Harold looked back then, younger, carefree, full of life. The man in the photo bore little resemblance to the quiet, reserved husband Margaret knew. What had changed him? What had turned their love story into a tragedy? Among the photos, Margaret found a small notebook filled with sketches and notes. It seemed to belong to Harold, judging by the handwriting. On one page, he had drawn a portrait of Eleanor, capturing her beauty with remarkable detail. Beneath it, he wrote, "Asterisk, I'll never forgive myself for what I've done." Those words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. Whatever happened between Harold and Eleanor, it haunted him for the rest of his life. Slowly, the pieces began falling into place. Harold hadn't just forbidden Margaret from entering the attic because he wanted to protect her. He did it to protect himself from judgment, from guilt, from the truth finally coming to light. For decades, he carried the weight of his actions, unable to move on or let go. And now, Margaret understood why. He wasn't just hiding Eleanor's story, he was hiding his own. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, sleep eluded her. Her thoughts kept returning to the attic and the secrets it held. She imagined Eleanor as a vibrant young woman, full of dreams and hopes for the future. She thought about Harold, burdened by regret and shame, trying to build a new life with Margaret while carrying the scars of his past. And she thought about herself, caught in the middle of a mystery that spanned generations. Margaret knew she couldn't keep this discovery to herself. Someone needed to know the truth, not just for Eleanor's sake, but for justice. Early the next morning, she contacted the local police department, explaining that she had uncovered evidence related to a cold case. At first, the officers were skeptical, but when Margaret showed them the knife, the letters, and the photographs, they took her seriously. Investigators arrived at the house later that day, combing through the attic and documenting everything. They found as the authorities worked, Margaret stood outside, watching silently. A part of her felt relief finally, the truth would come out. But another part of her felt a deep sadness. Harold had been her partner, her confidant, her love. Learning about his involvement in Eleanor's fate broke her heart in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Yet, she also felt compassion for him. He must have suffered immensely, carrying such a heavy secret for so many years. When the investigators finished their work, they thanked Margaret for bringing the case to their attention. They promised to reopen the investigation and pursue any leads they could find. Though it might take time, there was hope that Eleanor's story would finally reach a resolution. In the days that followed, Margaret made a decision. Instead of selling the house or moving away, she chose to stay. This was where her life with Harold had unfolded, and despite everything, it was still home. But she also wanted to honor Eleanor's memory. Margaret transformed the attic into a memorial, cleaning away the dust and cobwebs and arranging the items she had found with care. She placed fresh flowers beside the portrait of Eleanor and vowed to keep her story alive. Standing in the newly renovated attic, Margaret whispered, "Softly, you're free now." And for the first time in 35 years, the house felt truly quiet. Margaret's decision to stay in the house and turn the attic into a memorial for Eleanor wasn't made lightly. It was a choice born out of guilt, grief, and a deep sense of responsibility. She felt connected to Eleanor now not just because of the secrets they shared through Harold, but because she realized how much their lives overlapped without either of them knowing it. The same walls had sheltered both women, though decades apart. The same floors had carried their footsteps, and the same air had filled their lungs. And yet, while Margaret lived a full life with love and laughter, Eleanor's story had ended abruptly. Shrouded in mystery. Every day after the investigators left, Margaret spent hours in the attic organizing the items she'd found. She cleaned the dusty surfaces, polished the old furniture, and carefully arranged photographs and letters in frames. She wanted the space to feel like a tribute rather than a tomb, a place where Eleanor's memory could live on, untainted by the tragedy that followed her disappearance. But as she worked, memories of Harold kept surfacing, unbidden and unwelcome. His laughter echoed in her mind, his voice whispering softly in her ear. She could still picture him sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper, completely at ease. How could someone who seemed so ordinary harbor such a dark secret? One afternoon, as Margaret sorted through a box of mementos, she stumbled upon something she hadn't noticed before, a small, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a pile of old receipts. Its cover was worn, its pages brittle with age. At first glance, it looked like one of the journals she'd already gone through, but when she opened it, she realized it belonged to Harold. Her heart skipped a beat. This was different. It wasn't just random notes or sketches. It was a personal account of his thoughts and feelings during the time he knew Eleanor. The entries began innocently enough, describing Harold's excitement about meeting Eleanor and falling in love. He wrote about their dates, their conversations, and the dreams they shared for the future. Reading these early entries, Margaret saw a side of Harold she had never known, a passionate, romantic young man who believed in happily ever afters. But as she flipped further, the tone shifted dramatically. The words became darker, angrier, consumed by jealousy and insecurity. Harold admitted to doubting Eleanor's loyalty, convinced she was hiding something from him. He described arguments they had, accusations he hurled at her, and moments when he lost control of his temper. Margaret paused, her hands trembling as she read. One entry stood out, written in shaky handwriting, *, I don't know what I've done. I didn't mean to hurt her, but I couldn't stop myself. She looked so scared. What kind of monster am I? Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she absorbed the weight of his confession. For the first time, she understood the depth of Harold's guilt and the toll it must have taken on him. Whatever happened between him and Eleanor, it wasn't an accident. It was a moment of rage, of weakness that spiraled out of control. But the diary didn't end there. In the final pages, Harold wrote about leaving town, starting over, and trying to bury his past. He vowed never to let anyone get close to him again, fearing he would only bring harm. Then, years later, he met Margaret. She could see the shift in his tone when he wrote about her, how she brought light back into his life, how she made him believe in redemption. Yet even then, he admitted to carrying the burden of his secret, terrified that if she ever found out, she would leave him. Margaret closed the diary, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt anger at Harold for keeping this from her, for letting her fall in love with a man who carried such a heavy shadow. On the other hand, she felt sorrow not just for Eleanor, whose life was cut short, but for Harold, who spent decades punishing himself for his mistakes. He wasn't a villain, she realized. He was human, flawed, and broken, just like everyone else, determined to honor both Eleanor and Harold. Margaret decided to take things a step further. She reached out to the local historical society, sharing what she had uncovered and asking if they could help preserve Eleanor's story. To her surprise, they were eager to assist. Together, they organized a small exhibit featuring photographs, letters, and artifacts from the attic. They titled it Eleanor's Legacy, dedicating it to the woman whose life had been overshadowed by tragedy. The exhibit opened on a chilly autumn morning, drawing visitors from all over town. Many came out of curiosity, intrigued by the cold case that had baffled authorities for decades. Others came to pay their respects, moved by the idea of giving Eleanor a voice after so many years of silence. Margaret attended the opening, standing quietly in the corner as people wandered through the displays. She watched as strangers lingered over Eleanor's portrait, read her letters, and studied the newspaper clippings. Some wiped away tears. Others whispered prayers. It was exactly what Margaret had hoped for, a chance for Eleanor to be remembered not as a victim, but as a person. After the event, Margaret returned home, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The attic, once a forbidden space filled with dread, now felt peaceful. She climbed the stairs one last time, flashlight in hand, and sat among the relics of the past. The storm outside had passed, replaced by a calm, starry night. Moonlight streamed through the tiny window, casting soft shadows across the room. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the quiet envelop her as she sat there. She thought about Harold, the man she loved and the man she barely recognized anymore. She forgave him, not because what he did was excusable, but because holding on to anger wouldn't change anything. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding peace. And in that moment, surrounded by Eleanor's belongings and Harold's secrets, Margaret finally felt at peace. She whispered softly into the stillness, "You're free now." Whether she meant Harold, Eleanor, or herself, she wasn't sure. Maybe it was all three. Whatever the case, she knew one thing for certain. The weight of the past no longer chained her to this house. She could move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with her, but not letting them define her. When Margaret descended the attic stairs for the final time, she closed the door gently behind her. She turned the key in the lock, sealing the space off once more, but this time it wasn't out of fear or secrecy. It was an act of closure, a way of saying goodbye to the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. As she walked away, she felt lighter, freer, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Margaret's life didn't change overnight after she closed the attic door for the last time. Healing wasn't something that happened in an instant. It came slowly, like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. But as days turned into weeks, and then months, Margaret began to notice subtle shifts within herself. The house no longer felt heavy with secrets. Instead, it carried a quiet calm, as if Eleanor's spirit had finally found peace. And Harold? He remained a complicated figure in her mind, neither wholly good nor entirely bad, just human. At first, Margaret struggled with how to reconcile the man she loved with the man revealed by the attic's contents. She thought about all the years they spent together, the meals shared at the kitchen table, the late-night conversations under the stars, the holidays celebrated with laughter and warmth. Those memories weren't erased by the truth. They simply existed alongside it, forming a fuller picture of who Harold was. He wasn't perfect, but he had tried his best to make amends, even if only silently, by building a new life with Margaret. For that, she chose to hold on to gratitude rather than resentment. The town buzzed with talk about Eleanor's legacy, the exhibit Margaret helped create. People stopped her at the grocery store or on walks around the neighborhood to thank her for bringing Eleanor's story to light. Some shared their own memories of Eleanor, a kind word here, a smile there, painting a vivid portrait of the woman she had been before tragedy struck. Others admitted they'd always wondered what really happened but never dared to ask. Margaret listened patiently, nodding along, grateful for the opportunity to keep Eleanor's memory alive. One day, while tidying up the living room, Margaret stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away on a high shelf. She hadn't looked at it in years, and when she opened it, she was greeted by familiar faces, herself and Harold, smiling brightly at the camera during happier times. There were pictures from their wedding day, vacations, birthdays, and lazy Sundays spent lounging in the backyard. Flipping through the pages, Margaret paused at one particular photo. Harold standing beside the fireplace, looking directly into the lens. His expression was warm, almost tender, and for a moment she forgot about everything else. This was the man she married, the man who had loved her deeply despite his flaws. But as she stared at the photo, another realization dawned on her. Loving someone didn't mean ignoring their imperfections. It meant accepting them fully, scars and all. Harold wasn't just the man who painted serene landscapes or brought her wildflowers on spring mornings. He was also the man who made mistakes, who hurt others, and who carried guilt until his dying breath. By acknowledging both sides of him, Margaret felt like she was honoring not only his memory, but also her own journey of understanding Dot as winter approached. Margaret decided to host a small gathering at the house. She invited close friends and neighbors, people who had supported her through the ups and downs of the past few months. They filled the living room with chatter and laughter, sipping hot cocoa and reminiscing about old times. Someone mentioned Harold fondly, recalling a funny anecdote about his quirky habits, and Margaret smiled, feeling a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. These were the moments she cherished most, the ones where love outweighed loss. After everyone left, Margaret wandered into the hallway, stopping in front of the attic door. She hadn't touched it since sealing it shut, but tonight something compelled her to linger. She placed her hand on the cool wood, closing her eyes as memories flooded back. The dusty air, the creaky floorboards, the faint scent of forgotten things, all of it felt distant now, like echoes of another lifetime. Yet, she knew those echoes would always be part of her story, woven into the fabric of who she was. She stepped outside onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Against the crisp evening breeze, the stars twinkled above, scattered across the vast expanse of sky like tiny pinpricks of hope. Margaret gazed upward, wondering if Eleanor was watching over her somehow. Did she feel vindicated now that her story had been told? Did she forgive Harold for whatever role he played in her disappearance? Margaret didn't have answers to these questions, and maybe she never would. But she liked to think that somewhere, somehow, Eleanor had found peace. Back inside, Margaret lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill overlooking the front yard. Its flickering flame cast soft shadows on the walls, filling the room with a gentle glow. She sat down in her favorite armchair, pulling a blanket over her lap, and let her thoughts drift. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often painful, but it was also beautiful. Every chapter, every twist and turn added depth and meaning to the whole. Even the hardest parts, the losses, the betrayals, the heartaches had shaped her into the person she was today. In the weeks that followed, Margaret started journaling again, something she hadn't done since Harold passed away. At first, it was just a way to process her emotions, putting pen to paper to untangle the jumble of feelings inside her. But soon, it became more than that. She wrote letters to Eleanor, imagining what she might say if given the chance. She thanked her for teaching her resilience and courage, even though they had never met. She apologized for the pain Harold caused, hoping that somewhere beyond this world, Eleanor could hear her words. She also wrote to Harold not out of anger or blame, but out of love. She told him about the exhibit, about the people who came, to honor Eleanor's memory, and about how she had forgiven him. She assured him that their life together hadn't been wasted, that the joy they shared was real and worth holding on to. Writing those letters gave Margaret a sense of closure, like she was tying up loose ends and letting go of the past without forgetting it. Spring arrived sooner than expected. bringing with it bursts of color and new beginnings. Margaret spent hours tending to the garden, planting flowers and herbs in memory of Eleanor and Harold. She chose vibrant blooms, sunflowers, daisies, and marigolds to symbolize hope and renewal. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself, finding comfort in the rhythm of nature. The earth smelled fresh and alive, reminding her that life moved forward even after the darkest storms. One sunny afternoon, a young couple knocked on her door, introducing themselves as potential buyers interested in touring the house. Margaret had listed it for sale a few weeks earlier, knowing it was time to move on. Showing them around, she pointed out the quirks and charms of each room: the cozy nook by the fireplace, the view from the upstairs bedroom, the sturdy oak beams in the kitchen. When they reached the attic door, she hesitated for a moment, then handed over the key. "Go ahead," she said with a small smile. "It's safe." They climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing faintly, and emerged a few minutes later, wide-eyed and curious. "This place has so much character," the woman said, clutching her partner's hand. "It feels alive." Margaret nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Alive, that was exactly right. The house wasn't haunted anymore. It was ready for a new chapter, just like she was. When the couple left, Margaret stood in the empty hallway, taking one last look around. The house had been her home for nearly 40 years, but it was time to let it go. She packed her belongings slowly, savoring each memory attached to the items she boxed up. On moving day, as the movers loaded the truck, she took a final walk through the rooms, saying goodbye to the spaces that had sheltered her joys and sorrows. Standing on the porch, she glanced back at the house one last time. The attic window caught the sunlight, glowing warmly like a beacon. Margaret smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she trusted that whatever it was, it would be okay. After all, she had learned that life was about embracing both the shadows and the light and finding beauty in the balance between them.